Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Back again to talk about some of my thoughts about what is wrong with the healer meta these days. It's not one spec being better than everybody that's ruining everybody else's fun, but more so the entire system of healing that we're experiencing currently has some distinct problems, and I wanted to relate it to what we've seen in the past historically of what was really good back in the day and what I'd like for them to bring back, okay? Starting it off, I wanted to be able to show a little bit of footage from back in the day when I was doing progression on Mythic Gul'dan. Now, one of the big things that we saw going into the beginning of Dragonflight was a health and damage increase. And one of the reasons that they cited this was healer's strength. Now, a DPS player will think of their strength as like maybe being able to burst really quickly. Tanks talk a lot about their strength, what makes them feel strong, by being in control of their own health and in control of their own survivability. But what actually makes a healer strong is when they have the ability to top off a health pool from a player very rapidly. The faster you can top off a health pool, the stronger, let's say in this example, that a healer is. It doesn't mean that healer's the meta healer by any means. It just means the overall strength of healers at the moment. So, what I wanted to talk about today is that healers are way too strong in Dragonflight. And as a result, and Blizzard's talked about this a lot with a lot of old blue posts that I didn't want to bother digging up, is that they have to make healing extremely bursty as a response. And so this means that healers are able to bring you from 20% life to 100% very quickly, and then going into more and more burst effects. So if a player is getting hit for 80 or 90% of their life from an expected AoE hit, then if they're at 80 or 90% life when that hit goes out, obviously they're dead. So there's increased pressure for the healers to keep everybody at 100% health all of the time, no matter what. And I gotta tell you, I experienced this a lot at the beginning of the expansion with things like, Ruby life pools. If you guys did Ruby life pools at the start of Dragonflight, the damage it dealt was absurd. It was so much pressure, so much damage that you had to worry about all the time. And if you, like, one errant Cinderbolt went off, you were just dead. Which is bringing us into some of our thoughts about Aberrus, the new raid. But it's also similar to Vault of the Incarnates, even on like fights like Kurog, where if you're having an extra pulse of damage that everybody's not topped off for in a fight like Kurog, people will just die. And the focus, and especially like Razagath as well, you saw it in the World First race, players just needed to be at full health when a burst went off, otherwise they would perish. And personally, I think that's a lot more boring gameplay-wise than the game really ought to be, than the game really should be. And I wanted to look at some of these old clips, especially Gul'dan, but we also have a couple other ones that I'm going to highlight throughout this video to highlight that the way that we're in right now isn't the way everything needs to be. I liked looking at Gul'dan because it was an incredibly fun fight to progress from a cinematic perspective, but then you also noticed, and I hope you guys notice in these videos that I'm going to show, that players are not full health all the time. And it was actually okay. And I wasn't in like some bad guild or anything along those lines. This is when I was raiding an Incarnate in the Nighthold raid. And so I think we finished around, like, this was certainly Hall of Fame level before Hall of Fame existed. I want to say this was like 15th or 20th in the US at the time. You can always look it up on Warcraft logs or WoW Progress or something along those lines. But it's not like I was in like a heavily nerfed iteration of the encounter by any means, or playing with bad healers by any means. It was just that you were having players naturally and being expected to stay low health for these periods of time because the strength of the healers and also their ability to like burn their mana bar down to produce output meant that they just had to take their time topping off a health bar, and the burst damage and the pressure that you would get from those boss fights was acceptable. You could see slowly getting dragged by the winds, slowly taking some extra damage as we're fighting up against the winds to be able to stay on the platform and to be able to survive. I think another really good example of this is actually Gahun progression. And you can also get a look at, Jak 5 years ago, 4 years ago, or something like that today. But I think Gahoon was also a great example because you'd have these intermission phases where you'd have to burn the boss down, and then players would be taking these large pulses of damage, but they would also stay low, and it would be okay, and it would be expected that they would be staying low before you were able to fully get them topped off. This fight experienced a massive amount of rot damage to the point that healers like Resto Druid and Mistweaver, as you can see, were brought in spades to be able to sustain and sort of hold the tide. But a burst-oriented healer like Discipline Priest also did really well. In fact, in BFA, Discipline did a wonderful job of having less bursty output, but still relying on their evangelism ramps like we know today. They would have their Rapture and Evangelism used together, and then you would be using primarily like Schism, Penance, and Smite, and sustaining that output with each individual global. Instead of what we see in Dragonflight, where you have some globals like Light's Wrath hit like a truck, and then others like Smite hit for almost nothing. It was a very sustained output profile than we are usually used to seeing for Disc Priests. And it was interesting, and it was a lot of fun. I gotta tell you, a big part of me misses that aspect of the game where you see players at low health for consistent periods of time, and you're able to very successfully pull off a healing setup as a result of this. And again, I'll bring it back to what they did at the beginning of Dragonflight, where, in my opinion, they kind of took a half measure. They increased health for players, and they increased the damage that the bosses dealt, but they didn't actually want to nerf any healers in particular, notably Druid and Evoker being substantially farther ahead on Warcraft logs for just literally months at a time, putting together just ridiculous burst healing and obscene sustain when they needed to, but there weren't really a lot of like rot fights in Vault of the Incarnates. You had a lot of fights that would just pulse damage and then a couple seconds break, and then pulse damage and then a couple seconds break. Razageth in particular had immense burst damage where you needed to heal through some of these negative shielding effects and then be able to survive them and then be able to sort of make your way to the other side for the next round of mechanics that was going out. And so I kind of bring it back to this sort of like final phase of Gul'dan, where again, this is the beginning of an expansion, and you'd have some burst from rock falls going into the final phase, hitting people for 20% of their life, and I would have shields for 5 or 10% of players' life, and then I would slowly be working on topping them off, knowing that they would be safe or safe enough from the next round of pressure, the next wave of danger that would befall them. And I think the end of Gahoon was an amazing sort of like soft and rage effect that really reminded me of how epic it could be when you're not as powerful as a healer. Sure, it's satisfying being able to fully top off a player and fully realize the extent of your output and the extent of your power, especially at the end of expansions. But we're at the beginning of Dragonflight, and we're already pushing health pools up so rapidly that we're playing a game of whack-a-mole, and if we don't fully top off a player before an incoming hit, they just instantly will fall over and die from 80% health. And I gotta tell you, as a healer, especially for somebody who's been around for so many years, it feels really dissatisfying. I do want to highlight some of the things that they could also be doing about it too. In BFA, they actually made sure that healer power creep would not be too impactful. Going from the Uldir raid, which you see right here on Gahoon, into the Battle for Dazar'alor raid, they actually increased the stamina that you would gain from Azerite gear. It was like your head, shoulders, and chest. It replaced tier gear, basically. And they massively increased the stamina that you would get from those pieces of gear to make it so that you just considerably ballooned in health and made sure you had a ton of health going into the new tier. And that meant you were also taking more damage and you're steadily growing in terms of the health that you would have to fight up against. And you can see fights like Gahoon where everyone's low, consistently low, not getting topped off, not able to get topped off, and then you are just fighting against the clock to be able to survive. Unlike some kind of Kurog fight that we were really seeing in the Race to World First for Vault of the Incarnates, where a single pulse of damage could just destroy you, and that was that. That stuff was just kind of beyond frustrating. And even in areas where we did actually see healers being very powerful, you can kind of see it on Varamathras in the Antorus raid at the end of Legion. You could also counter it with bosses that had a lot of rot damage. And this is one that Varamathras is extremely famous for, is that he kept on ticking down the raid all the time, making it a substantial healer challenge to go against these anti-healing effects that would go out onto players, and the rot damage they would sustain, and trying to use some kind of shielding effects to be able to keep players alive through it at the exact same time. So it was a really interesting sort of balancing act that you had to play with just to make sure people would survive, stay in the fight, and also knowing that they're not just going to like die in an instant. I think for me, those are some of the periods that I enjoyed healing the most. Whenever it comes to, you know, burst healers like Disc Priest, yeah, you always want to be first, you want to always capture the healing, but I think there's something to be said about having these sort of like all-in moments for output. Either you just hit this narrow window of time to push together all your healing and you succeed, or you don't and players die. It also puts a ton of emphasis on raid healing cooldowns instead of the pure strength of that healer or the skill of that healer. Because no matter if you're a world first raider or you're a AOTC raider, if your gear is the same, Tranquility is still going to do the same amount of healing. Divine Hymn is still going to do the same amount of healing. Having a large distribution of your healing coming from raid cooldowns means it's insanely important that you have enough of these cooldowns on hand to be able to, keep players alive through the burst. And when fights are more bursty, I feel like you're even more reliant upon these raid cooldowns to be able to help keep you alive. So for me, I think what they need to be able to do is massively balloon the health of players, possibly just kind of nerf all the healers equally at the same time to be able to just widen out this delta a little bit, massively increase the raid damage that's coming into the Aberrus raid, and also, and finally, they got to give some thought to things like Nature's Vigil and Ancestral Guidance, because very famously in WoW's history, we did see the solo heal of Mythic Garrosh, or I guess it was Heroic Garrosh before they made Mythic, by a Holy Priest. And part of that was not only the player skill, which was obvious, but it was also because there was a lot of value in like off Tranks, off Healing Tide, off healing from DPS classes. And that's another consideration that I hope Blizzard's going to look into as well before we get into the Aberrus raid, because I really want it to be into a world where healers are constantly expected to be healing, constantly forced to be doing additional healing, and I don't need to worry about this whole silly like DPS thing. What I want to be doing is focusing on healing as a healer and be challenged to do it every single time. But let me know what you guys think. If you have any other memories you'd like to share from previous raids and from previous expansions in terms of healer strength, let me know in the description down below. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch y'all next time.